With that said, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Mark Martin, and his talk is Treasury. They're all similar, just more or less zeros. So Mark started in Treasury back in the 80s for the Bank of Tokyo on the money market desk, where he settled million-dollar balances daily. He also was involved in a multi-billion-dollar commercial paper program and a commodity swap for, who was that for again? Export Development Canada. He's also has 10 years of municipal experience and is now the manager of Treasury at the City of Ottawa, where he has a portfolio of $2.1 billion of debt. I guess we got to pay for our light rail somehow. And I couldn't memorize all these stats, but I want to rhyme them off. So he also manages a $500 million fixed income portfolio, a $200 million endowment fund, an $80 million sinking fund, and an interest rate swap and commodity swap of approximately $200 million. He's got a lot of money to deal with. So without further ado, here is Mark Martin.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Am I on? Yeah, okay, good. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to speak to every one of you today. And that was very exciting, and if that's an example of Generation Y, things are pretty exciting going forward. So I'm from the baby boom generation, so I'm way back on his scale. My name is Mark Martin. I'm manager of Treasury, and like he said in your introduction, I worked for the Bank of Tokyo in the 80s. And one of the interesting things about the Bank of Tokyo in the 80s, it was the dominant economy in the world, and so I was able to watch Japan decline over the next 20 years or 30 years. And one of the interesting things about that is we're now starting to hear more and more that the current situation we're facing is very similar to what Japan faced in the 80s, hence the very low interest rates today. Another thing I did is I worked on a currency desk. That was very exciting too. And then, of course, he was talking about the export credit agency I worked for as well, where I managed a $2 billion commercial paper book. And I also managed a $1 billion currency book. So those were all very interesting things that I did. But I got to tell you, the most interesting 5 years of my life in the business world has been the last 5 years. And I've seen us work our way through the Great Recession. I wanted to tell you, too, about my experience through those different jobs. The Bank of Tokyo, my interview was with a Japanese businessman. And the interview was he pulled out a cigar and he told a joke. I laughed at the joke, I got hired. Then I went to the Sked A Bank. They pulled out 3 cigars. They told a joke, I laughed at the joke, I was hired. Then I went to and that was men as well. Then I went to an export credit agency interview. It was done by a woman. I had to prove I was qualified for the job and I understood it. I was hired, but the interview was much harder, and we did much better things. So you can see how the world's changed. The introduction of women, it's made a difference. I stole the concept. It's more or less zeros. I stole that from my predecessor, MJ, who I replaced her on the investment book for the City of Ottawa. And when I replaced MJ, she went off to the Treasury Board. So she's working for the Government of Canada and doing something similar, but for the Government of Canada. And I met with her shortly after I took her job. And she sat down with me and she says, Mark, it's the same thing, just more zeros. And that's where I understood that. Treasuries were all similar. When I was at EDC, it was also very similar. So when you go to a Treasury, they're all similar. It's just more zeros. This diagram, I like this diagram, because what is it doing? It's showing a banker, and he's pulling on strings. And I think that's very similar to what Treasury does. We face many different departments, and we're pulling on different strings, and we're operating as the banker for the City of Ottawa. So MJ, who's at Treasury, she's not working as a banker, but she's bringing it all together as well. So it's all very similar. Okay, I like this graph, or this little depiction, because one of the things it's showing us at the top the treasurer. Under that is the deputy treasurer, and then that's me, the manager of Treasury. So the interesting thing about that within the municipal world, and I was talking to Caleb earlier, to me the treasurer in a municipal world is not a treasurer. She's a CFO, and I use the term she, because in the City of Ottawa, the treasurer and the deputy treasurer are both females. And the reason I'm saying that they're more like CFOs, they don't just touch Treasury. They've got many departments. The deputy treasurer has 150 people reporting to her, and I have 4 people reporting to me. And that's more the Treasury operation as I see it. One of the things I also like to point out, over the last 5 years, like I was saying, it's probably been, more, in terms of business experience from my own personal side, it's probably been the most fascinating 5 years of my life. And that as a collective, we've worked our way through the Great Recession. And the treasurer and the deputy treasurer, at least within the City of Ottawa, were leaders in leading the City of Ottawa through that. And it was an immense amount of change, and it had to happen quickly. And I think at the municipal level, that happens a lot faster than as you start going up the different tiers of government. So municipal levels of government are able to respond a lot faster than some of the upper tiers. And I think that's why a lot of times things are downloaded to municipalities. You can see we have a very small team, but really it comes down, we're bankers, we're investors, we issue debt, and we do some of the accounting functions. But I still haven't told you a lot about Treasury. So Treasury, when you think of the concept of Treasury, a lot of people don't know what Treasury is. But it's very similar to your own personal Treasury. So let's just go through the process. So when you're young, you probably went with your parents and you open a bank account. Well, the City of Ottawa has bank accounts as well. Then as you started getting older, you were looking to do something within your life. You either were looking to get an education, buy your first car, buy a home. A lot of times you didn't have enough money to purchase those things, so you went out and got a loan. And it's very similar with municipalities. A lot of times we don't have the money to make the large purchase, so we go out and get a loan to finance it over a period of time. Then finally, investing. You refer to it as saving for a rainy day. We refer to it as liquidity. And the one thing that we have that an individual doesn't have is we have access to some expertise. And I like this group of characters. The woman on your left is Janet Yellen. Janet Yellen is the head of the Federal Reserve. And you can see her very stern face. You're going to have good answers for Janet Yellen. The 2 gentlemen on the other side are Stephen Poloz, the head of the Bank of Canada, and Mark Carney, who previously was the head of the Bank of Canada and was scooped away by Britain, is now the head of the Bank of England. And you can see that they're having a much better time and probably having a scotch and a little jovial. But that woman on the left is probably one of the most powerful women in the world. There's one other woman that's very powerful as well, which is Christine Lagarde, who is the head of the IMF and basically led Europe through their problems. So women are making a very strong presence in the business world. So let's get back to banking. That's where we all start. That's where it all starts. For the City of Ottawa, Treasury, we do manage the bank accounts. We have over 20 bank accounts that we manage, and they're for various reasons, and we've got a list. One of the things, I've got this depiction of this man researching the newspapers, but really what I wanted to depict is how much we have to study each and every journal entry that comes through the banking. So when you guys do a transaction, it goes through the bank, we're getting a download from that bank, and we're putting it into our cash flow forecast. We have to reconcile each and every number. It's actually gotten more difficult than less difficult, and one of the reasons it's gotten so difficult, it's with the automation or online banking. And the thing about online banking, it's fantastic, it's making things work faster, but currently we're getting transactions that are coming through, and we don't always understand what that transaction is. So it entails a ton of research and investigation. And if I was going to pass on anything to the audience here today, is make sure you work with your treasury and identify cash flows. If there's one thing that my team is always harping on, is you've got to follow those cash flows through, and you've got to notify your treasury group of cash flows. It's probably the one thing that's holding up treasury operations more than anything else. So cash flow forecast, that's another thing. We do a lot of forecasting, but from banking comes a lot of transactions, and they're all downloaded online into our cash flow forecast, and that's the key to our operations. So it predicts flows out for 1 year, and that's how we implement our investment strategies, that's how we implement our debt strategies. So without a cash flow forecast, it's very difficult to operate as a treasury. We do other types of forecasting as well. We forecast earnings. One of the important things about forecasting earnings is that goes to budgets, and that helps budgets delegate their spending and make their long-range financial plans or their budget strategies. And finally, interest rate forecasts. So Treasury. So one of the things that they rely on us for is to make interest rate forecasts or make interest rate predictions. But it's not actually us that are making the interest rate forecasts and predictions. We're going out and we're sourcing Bloomberg, which is a data information system. We're going out to all the bank economists and we're going out to the markets and we're commingling all their forecasts and then we're relaying those forecasts in an interpretive way to upwards to the deputy treasurer and treasurer for them to make decisions. So collectively, we come up with a strategy. A lot of our role is working with outside consultants and market makers. We do forecast oil prices as well. So back to borrowing. So the City of Ottawa, like I said, might have a project or is looking to fund something as well. We only fund capital projects, so we don't fund operations. But it's basically, you're looking to build a building. We don't have the funds now. And so we're going to go out to the capital markets or we're going to go out to the banks for a loan and we're going to source funds to build these buildings. So why would we source those funds? One of the reasons we want to source those funds and spread that payment out of a lifespan is we want that building to be paid for by the users. So if we pay for it today, then it's the people that are paying their taxes today that are going to have to foot the bill for that building. If we borrow for that building, spread the cost of that building over a 20-year lifespan, which is the lifespan of the building, then we've distributed the cost of that building across the users. So that's one of the objectives of funding. We currently have $1.6 billion in debt. We have $16 billion in assets. So if you wanted to put that in perspective, that's like having a $300,000 house with a $30,000 mortgage. The average life of our borrowing program right now is 10.7 years, and the average yield on our borrowing is 4.16%. We are rated by credit rating agencies. So one of the mandates we're doing when we're issuing debt is we're also trying to maintain our credit rating. So we're monitored by Moody's and Standard & Poor's. Currently, we have good credit ratings, AAA with Moody's, which is the highest, AA+, which is close to the highest with Standard & Poor's. We're always trying to maintain that level of credit. So when we access the markets, how are we doing it? We have a number of ways we can raise capital. One is through the capital markets. So we go to the banks who have capital markets departments, and we contract with them or we work with them to establish a debt issue. They'll go out to investors, sell our debt, and then that's how we raise capital through the capital markets. So that's how we issue a bond. The other possibility is we can source money through the banks, through a loan. Not as often. We're trying to get money out in the markets, and we can actually fund by issuing debt better than we can actually borrow from a bank. And of course, the governments, Infrastructure Ontario, FCM, and CMHC, have become a much more popular. They're actually sourcing funds better for us than we can actually issue debt. And so why is that? They're a bigger tier government, and so therefore they should be able to fund cheaper, and they pass on that savings to the municipalities. We are governed by how and what we can issue. So we're governed by the Municipal Act. The Municipal Act establishes what we can and how we can issue debt. And then we take it one more step further, and at the municipal level, we put in additional guidelines and restrictions. So in some ways, that's burdensome, because we have two tiers of government above us, and a lot of times we're borrowing on their behalf, we end up having much more requirements on the legislative side when we're issuing our debt. It makes it quite restrictive and more cumbersome to issue that debt. On the other side, one of the things that's happened in the United States, they don't have the same criteria around their municipalities. And so when we went through this Great Recession, they actually weren't able to maintain that credit rating that I was talking about earlier. So to actually access capital markets became very difficult. So what we've been able to do through that period is we've been able to head down to the United States, attract that investor base, and that's helped us by having more investors that want to buy our bonds. It's brought our cost of borrowing down. So it's helped the municipalities bring that level of borrowing down quite a bit. Investing, so liquidity. I refer to it as saving money for a rainy day as an individual. I refer to it as liquidity for a municipality. So it always starts, there's a number of sources of funds. So taxes come in on an operating base, and that's for a number of different things. We'll invest those taxes over a one-year period or through a budget year to make sure we get through the budget year. We've got to make payments for payrolls. We've got to pay for snow removal. We have to pay for salt. There's a number of things, school boards we pay for. So there's a number of the things that we're trying to match the operating cash flows through a year. So if we get in March $2 billion, we're going to spread that money out such that it can meet those requirements with our cash flow forecast. Second, we have a bunch of reserves. And the reserves come from DCs, development charges. It comes from gas tax. It comes from a number of different types of reserves that we hold. So with the reserves, we've got a longer time frame. So we can go out to 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, out to 10 years, out to 20 years. So with those funds, we're going to try to move out the yield curve. A yield curve usually goes upward sloping. So we're going to try to push those funds out the yield curve to increase the return. A sinking fund, quite often when we issue debt, we're not allowed to issue a 10-year debt for $10 million, and at the end of that 10 years, pay back that $10 million. We have to do it more like a mortgage. When you do a mortgage, each and every year you're paying back some principal. So what we do to generate that type of scenario is we'll issue that bond that's going to be due in 10 years, and we're going to have to pay that $10 million back in 10 years. But each and every year, we have to put aside some capital or some principal to repay, so that when we get to that 10-year period, we've got the $10 million sitting in the bank. So we're investing those funds, as we're going through the 10-year time horizon. City of Ottawa is unique in that we've got an endowment fund. We had money that was paid to us from Ottawa Hydro. And what we did with that money is we created an endowment. It was $200 million. So we had a couple of options with that money. That money, that $200 million could have been used to pay down our debt. And our debt costs tend to be right now approximately 4.5%. The other option is we could have invested that money. So if we invested that money in the fixed income markets, it would have been invested somewhere at 3.5%. So we would have probably been losing about 100 basis points. Doesn't make any sense. So what we did is we went out and we did a study of a proper asset allocation for a balanced investment fund. So I don't know if any of you have invested in a balanced mutual fund, but we did that. So what we've added is we've added equities. So by added the equity portion, and we're 60% equities, 40% fixed income, what we've done by adding that equity portion is we've taken that 3.5% yield, if it was strictly fixed income, we've added equities, and it's enhanced that yield, and it's taken it up to 6.5%. So now we're funding at 4.5%, and we're investing that money at 6.5%, so we're actually picking up 200 basis points, and it's helping us with our long-term financial planning. And finally, pensions. We do have two-stranded pensions. And we don't actually invest those funds, but we help select managers with those funds. And finally, one of the things we do is hedging. So OC Transpo has a bunch of buses. They fill up those buses up with diesel, and diesel prices fluctuate up and down. One of the things that we're attempting to do is we're trying to help OC Transpo manage their bus budget by flattening out the cost of the diesel. So we're trying to fix the price of diesel 1 year or 2 years out into the future. So there's a number of ways you can do that. One of the ways you can do it is when you go to your supplier, you can ask them for a fixed price, and they'll lock your price in for a year. Another way you can do it is through the financial markets. So when originally we were doing all our fixing through the supplier, and about 5 years ago, suppliers came back to us and said, we don't want to fix the prices anymore because the prices were too volatile and it was too risky for the supplier. So we had to find another venue to do that. We approached the banks, and the banks came back to us with this concept of swap. And we really like that word because it makes us sound really smart. But swap is effectively works like this. Let's say we want to lock our price in at $1. Throughout the year, the prices are going to go like this. So if we lock in at $1 with the bank, if the price goes to $1.30, we're still going to pay that $1.30 through the year, and the bank is going to pay us 30 cents through the year. So it brings our price back down to $1. So that's effectively all a swap does. It just takes our floating rate prices, converts it into a fixed, and it's just a net payment to the City of Ottawa. It's a very simple concept, but it sounds very complicated with the word swap. And we do some modeling that. We do some linear modeling. So it's a straight model. And finally, that's about it. I think I just wanted to end by talking about Generation Y, my experience with Generation Y. One of the things that we have to do is we're audited with our investments, we're audited with our debt, we're audited with our hedging. So funny thing, most of the auditors that are coming in to see us are Generation Y. So over the last X number of years, I've read a number of things in the papers talking about Generation Y. They're not prepared, they're lazy, they're not motivated. That's not been my experience at all. The kids that are coming in and working with me, the Generation Y, they're prepared, they're smart, and the one thing I notice even most important is they're balanced. So they're hard workers, but they're out and they're having fun or they're playing. So one of the things, if I could say anything to the Generation Y, is that balance. And when I look at Caleb, I see a very balanced young man. I think that's one thing that will make our generation, or going forward, a much stronger economy. So I haven't experienced Generation Y being lazy or not motivated at all. I've experienced the exact opposite. These people are very smart. They're very, very motivated. They can do the same work that the baby boomers can do, but they can do it in less time, and they can do it faster. And so I think we got a great future going forward. So if there's any questions, let me know.
Yeah, we'll do that
at the end.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay, thank you.
I think he downplays the title a little bit. I think the more zeros, it gets a lot more interesting real quick. But anyway, thank you, Mark, for presenting. It's funny, when our financial statements come out, our net debt seems to get the most traction. And obviously, our net debt will be growing as our city grows. But again, as Mark said, it is an efficient way to allocate that cost of, say, that capital asset over the lifespan of it to our taxpayers. So anyway, thank you, Mark. So